Inaya Folarin Iman, and you are the director of Free Speech Union. And you've written articles for Spiked, and you've also been on a whole host of like TV shows such as Vox, Politics Live, BBC Sunday Politics. And the interesting thing about you that I've noticed is that you actually stood as a parliamentary candidate for the Brexit Party. So that's pretty amazing. Yeah, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually founding an organization that's going to be launched on the 28th of July, so I'm going to plug it quickly. It's called the Equiano Project, and it's going to be a new debate, discussion, and ideas forum about race, culture, and politics. So check it out.
Is it specifically those issues, or is it just an organization which seeks to further the kind of free speech values that you hold?
Yeah, so the organization is about promoting and facilitating conversations about freedom, humanism, and universalism. It's kind of a challenge to the dominant discourse on race, which is more about kind of identity politics and factionalism and that form of anti-racism. We're hoping to kind of challenge and broaden and move the conversation forward about race, but centraling freedom as the fundamental value.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And like I said before, when I look at you and, you know, with some of the work that you've done, you are very atypical to me. You know, you don't hear every day that, you know, a 23-year-old has actually stood as a parliamentary candidate, but you are also atypical with, in my experience, with the views that you hold. I don't hear my friends saying the same things you do or having the same opinions as you. And I want to ask you, why do you think that is? Do you think that a lot more young people actually have the same opinions as yourself, but we just don't hear them in the mainstream media? Or is it just genuinely because there is an actual deficit in kind of a diversity of ideas like yours?
Yeah, no, I think it's both of those things. So anytime I'm on television or the radio will put something out that gets a lot of attention, I often get literally hundreds of young people messaging me saying, you know, wow, that's really interesting. You know, I've been thinking similar things, but I haven't really known kind of a coherent argument or where to look and those kinds of things. So I definitely think that there is a huge groundswell of young people in particular who do have similar ideas, but don't necessarily have the avenue or the social networks or the friends that will kind of cultivate those ideas that might be similar to mine. But on top of that, I do think that there is a huge lack of ideological and intellectual diversity when it comes to mainstream ideas that are kind of particularly pushed toward young people. So, for example, you know, I graduated university last year, and as much as I did really enjoy my university experience, it was actually my university experience which was very much the catalyst for why I became very passionate about these types of issues, because I found that there wasn't much critical debate and you know, ideas that were kind of pro-free speech or pro-Brexit or even just conservative in any way were framed as like fundamentally evil. And I'm thinking, well, even if they are evil, which obviously I don't believe they are, the reality is, you know, for example, the Brexit vote, the majority of the country voted that way. And if we are going to be the people of the future that will then inherit, you know, the institutions, whether that's the media, politics, whatever, we have to be able to understand deeply and engage with the range of ideas that exist within society. And I think that particularly for young people, the dominant orthodoxy is kind of left-wing woke identity politics ideas. There's not enough diversity in my opinion.
I know there's a lot of people that from my social circle that will be watching this, and they have no idea what woke means. What is woke politics to you?
Yeah, so to me, woke politics is essentially a type of politics that uses the language of kind of justice and kind of helping minorities, whether that's ethnic or sexual minorities like the LGBT community. But the tactics that are used are often what I would argue to be tactics that are not ultimately in the interest of the people that they're proposing to protect. So the way that I would argue is, for example, part of what people argue would be an expression of woke politics is cancel culture. This idea that if someone says something offensive or says something that, you know, you might disagree with, that you are then entitled to kind of silence or vilify or essentially remove that person's livelihood. Or this idea in universities, I don't know if you've heard about it, like no platforming in safe spaces. This idea that a small group of people get to dictate for everybody else what views and ideas can or cannot be heard. And it's always done in the name of helping minorities or helping marginalized groups. But what we often find, and I think I'm to some extent an example of it, but not a significant one, when there are ethnic minorities that might challenge this view, say, well, actually, I don't support the politics of identity. I don't feel that I'm victimized by society. I don't believe that Western society is a kind of white supremacist patriarchy. A lot of the time, people like myself and others are dismissed as inauthentic or yeah, exactly. All of these types of things. And I think that's what I would argue essentially is woke politics, something that uses the language of moral superiority and justice, but often uses tactics that are in opposition to those goals.
Right. Going back to your experience at university, what was some of the specific cases that you had come across that actually thought, you know what, I need to do something about this?
Yeah, so so I'll track it back a little bit. So for example, I grew up really interested in ideas. Like yourself, I was kind of part of the YouTube generation. And the way in which I utilized YouTube was, yes, both for funny cat videos, but also because I tried to expose myself to loads of different ideas. I would watch so many different political shows and people expressing opinions, and I became really interested in, you know, the diversity of views that this world had to offer, whether that was religious or philosophical or political. And I hope that my university experience will continue that process. And again, as I described earlier, I found it was something somewhat different. So what I decided to do was utilize my university experience to hopefully create a climate where I can engage with these ideas. So I decided to join my university student newspaper as a features editor. And I remember one time during that same period, there was a big movement that was emerging. You might have heard of it, like decolonize the curriculum.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I was really interested in it. But what I found was that as much as I found it really interesting, the movement was not going challenged at university. And I think that all ideas should be challenged, no matter how good or helpful or positive they frame, they should be challenged. So I suggested when I was at the student newspaper, if someone should write an article saying, you know, showing the pros and cons of the decolonize the curriculum movement. And when I did that, it sparked a huge backlash on campus. You know, it spread far and wide. Many people, said that just by asking that question, you know, I was forwarding all of these, you know, white supremacism and things like that. And it really was a wake-up call for me. You know, I thought that no matter how good you think your ideas are, no one is infallible. We can all be wrong. We all make mistakes, and we have to be able to justify our position, particularly if we want to change the culture on campus. So that really showed me that we need to create a bigger climate for free speech and debate and discussion, no matter what the ideas are.
And did you find any particular problems with the decolonize the curriculum movement?
So personally, yes, I did. So I'm obviously all for expanding the curriculum, you know, bringing in writers and ideas and authors from different parts of the world. But there were several claims about the decolonize the curriculum movement that I particularly had a problem with. So one of them was that I thought it was actually quite ideological. Like I thought it seemed to me that it wasn't necessarily just to broaden the perspectives of writers. It was a particular idea to kind of frame Western society as a society that was inherently racist and part of racist and sexist ideas. And I think that that's a different thing from just broadening the debate. That's trying to tell people a particular narrative about the way Western society is. I also had a problem with it insofar as I was concerned about how it was framing Asian and African countries. It was framing them as like, you know, just these kind of poor countries that were all just victims of Western imperialism, and they weren't necessarily, and this idea like objectivity and kind of freedom was somehow Western centric ideas. That's not true. Many of these ideas, even in the Enlightenment, has roots in India, has roots in many African countries. You know, many of these values that we support are actually universal values. And I thought it was wrong that history was being framed as solely kind of the West versus the East, when a lot of the time it was much more complex and much more nuanced than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That completely makes sense. And so after trying to critique some of the kind of ideological framework of decolonize the curriculum, you decided that actually freedom of speech is something that we really need. But do you think that the backlash that you received was actually more so an emotional backlash than one which actually sought to look at your ideas and take them apart in a more practical sense?
Yeah, for me, I found it to be largely emotional. You know, nobody in that backlash actually critiqued anything that I specifically said. What they often critiqued what they thought were the implications of what perhaps even debating this subject might mean. And again, I think that that's dangerous. I think that all ideas are open. And if we are, you know, particularly in a university, if we cannot have a rational conversation that is respectable and open, then where else can we have it? You know, university, we would hope, would be a kind of an example environment of, you know, a kind of intellectual and open climate, and that hopefully is like the kind of microcosm for how we want society to be. If we can't, in the very space where ideas are cultivated and challenged, be able to think critically and open and withstand even offensive or provocative views, then how can we really function properly within society, where we would be exposed to so many different types of people and so many different ideas to which we can't control?
But in some way, do you think that the emotion is understandable? Some people that may have reacted may have actually suffered genuine incidences of racism. So do you think, in part, that the emotional aspect of the backlash is understandable, at least?
I think that, I'm not sure. You know, I think that if I was trying to propagate genuinely horrifically Nazi racist ideas, and maybe we can have a legitimate argument about whether or not that was appropriate. You know, that's not, I'm a woman of African heritage, and many of these people are speaking for me and, you know, trying to say that they're acting on my behalf, but then are denying an opportunity for myself to exert my own freedom, my own agency, and my own ideas. So yes, people you know, may feel particularly emotionally invested in a conversation about racism because of the experiences that they've had. But the reality is, you know, and this might sound harsh, but, you know, everybody experiences all different types of things, whether that's racism, sexism, you know, abuse, or you know, childhood trauma. There are many different incidences that people experience that, you know, are unfortunate and we're sad about. But the best way to kind of deal with that within society is not to shut down other people, is not to kind of restrict the climate to which people can engage with the world. It's to make sure that we have an open environment where we can talk about these things freely. I'd rather someone, even if they completely disagreed with my very existence by being a kind of woman of African heritage, I'd rather them tell me the truth. I'd rather know the truth than to pretend that, you know, these people don't exist and you know, and remove them from the face of public life.
I think personally speaking, it's very difficult to have these conversations in the first place because of the way in which they're set up. When people obviously bring emotion, which is a completely valid thing to do, but when they bring it to the actual structure or the sense of the argument, they actually set up the argument to make the, you know, argument an ad hominem argument or a personal argument. Well, you're not black, you'll never understand, or whatever the argument may be. How do you think it's best to kind of, because then I feel that it barricades any kind of intellectual discussion that could be had. How do you think you could overcome this? How do you think you could kind of dismantle that?
Yeah, so I think that's such an important question. We hear a lot this idea of like, you as a white person, you will not be able to understand, and these things. And I think that people don't realize that what they're saying when they make that statement is actually a really fundamental opposition to many of the ideas that were championed, particularly in the early half of the civil rights movement. One of the things that we talk about, or one of the things that I talk about, is this idea of universalism. So this is this idea essentially that we all, and also humanism, we are all at the fundamental level humans, and we may not have the exact same experiences as different human beings, but we all have the same emotions, we have the same perceptions, we have the same faculties within us to be able to judge a situation. So I don't necessarily need to have directly experienced, domestic violence to be able to at least imagine that that can be a horrific thing, and understand that maybe that's not something that I would want for somebody else. So similarly with racism, I don't think that a white person necessarily has to have someone shout the N-word on the street for them to be able to imagine what it's like for another human being to experience demonization or ostracization, because we all experience that in different ways. So I personally reject the idea that, you as a white person or me as a black person cannot really understand one another, because no two black people's experiences are the same, let alone a black and a white person. So I think to overcome it, that's we need to go back to those principles that start off with, we are all human beings. We may not experience this exact same thing, but we all experience very similar things and can empathize and can sympathize and can work with one another to really try and make society better. As soon as we start putting these kind of really strict boundaries in communication, then ultimately it just becomes a struggle for power. Because if I can't communicate with you and you can never understand me, then what are we doing? We're just on a collision course then against one another. And so we have to go back to these principles of universalism, of humanism, of the ultimate belief that we all just want to be free, to have a positive and good life. And what unites us is stronger than what divides us. That's what I'm essentially saying.
Exactly. I think fundamentally everybody, 90% of people out there are fundamentally the same. Everybody values emotion, everybody values empathy, everybody values kindness. But I think when people try and kind of force ideology in and try and use these kind of ad hominem arguments, kind of undermine those values that we all have together. So yeah, I definitely agree with you on that there. You also spoke about in your interview with in Trigonometry about the importance of personal responsibility. We don't really hear about that often. Why is it so important to be personally responsible, and how do you think personal responsibility can actually change the narrative that we hear in the media, for example, about race?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons why I've come to these conclusions is a lot of it is genuinely based off of my mother. I kind of talked about her very briefly. She worked 3 jobs to improve the life of my sister and I. She, on paper, has many different things that she could say, oh, society is against me, society victimized me. But every single day she would wake up, with a smile on her face and, have a really go-getting attitude. And that was so compelling. So if, someone like my mom and many other, immigrant families who work incredibly hard to improve the life of their kids can actually see society as an opportunity and not an obstacle, then how can I, a second generation who has been born into a society that has provided so many opportunities, start saying that society is against me? For me, that's a huge slap in the face. And for me, that's where personal responsibility comes from. Yes, there are things about society that needs to change, but I don't believe that unless I did the things that I've done in terms of reflecting, improving myself, working hard, taking responsibility for my life, I would not have had, I believe, to be the discernment, the proper discernment, to see what about society is wrong versus what about me needs to change. And I think that's the problem. A lot of people go, society first. I'm not getting what I want. It must be because society, it is somehow working against me. And I think that when you think like that, you can never be responsible for your own actions. Of course, you're going to want to change things, but how do you know?
Nature to blame external factors, to blame society, to blame the government, to blame X, Y, and Z? Isn't that just human nature?
I think that it doesn't have to be, because
Right.
the way that we have changed over just, the last 100 years, even the last 1,000 years, is an example that we can constantly, we don't have to behave in what I would argue are, the perhaps, more primal natures that kind of work against us, such as tribalism. Some of the things we're talking about is an example of kind of probably primitive tribalism. I don't think that we have to do that. I think that and I said it in my trigonometry interview, I think our society would be completely different if everybody individually cultivated their own sense of agency and freedom and didn't quickly jump to who can I blame for my current situation.
Right. And it's interesting that you talked about your background and your mother as an immigrant. I don't know if you've heard of some of the work that Thomas Sowell has done in the 1970s. That was when he was active. I think he's a bit too old to do any of this anymore. But he actually found that, the experiences of, this was in the US, so the experiences of immigrant Black families, for example, from the West Indies, the outcomes, they are so much more different to the outcomes of Black people already living in the United States, because I guess some of it's hard to describe, because some of it just boils down to culture and just values. So for example, if you look at some of the immigrants that have come from the West Indies into the US, they are, X amount of times more hardworking, or X amount of times more resilient. And his work has actually shown that, for example, within these two subgroups of Black people in particular neighborhoods, it turns out that they are actually subject to the same amount of, racism that there is in society in America, or the policing injustices. So that's pretty much constant. But despite that, it just so happens that the immigrant subgroup end up doing much, much better. They have children who end up doing significantly better at schools, a higher enrollment into universities, and they end up earning more than the other subgroup. So I think there is some sort of correlation with the data out there with what you're saying, and kind of having those personal values to kind of propel you.
I completely agree, and those statistics that you put forward are incredibly important. What is really fascinating is that Nigerian immigrants to America are actually one of the most successful immigrant groups, as you've actually described, and I think that they're actually one of the most educated immigrant groups in America. So what we are finding, and as again you've just evidenced, and a similar thing is being correlated in the UK, is that many of these people that are coming from, as you described, kind of resilient and cultures that prioritize certain values, are actually finding that they are able to in some ways overcome the obstacles that may be facing them in terms of structurally or societally. And a similar picture is hugely being painted in the UK. The fact that Indian immigrants are now one of the most successful population when it comes to a medium household income. Interestingly, in Britain, the highest medium household income is not from white people, it's from Chinese, it's from Indian, it's from Jewish people. So we're actually finding that many immigrant groups that, at least from the current narrative, are meant to be held back by various forms of racism, are absolutely succeeding. And so the racism argument for racial disparities is not painting a complete picture whatsoever.
Right. A lot more complex than that. Yeah, I do find that the narrative that we hear in the new media is usually just an oversimplification of some of the data that we have. And it's not just, if only that it were that easy to just say, this is the problem and this is how we should go about things, but it's actually not, and it's a lot more complicated. And I just want to go back to free speech, and I just want to ask you, what are your kind of restraints on free speech? When does free speech actually become hate speech?
So this is a really interesting question. And I think that personally, and I will just be honest with you, I think that we already have quite strict legal boundaries in relation to free speech. So, you know, I can't advocate support for a terrorist organization. You know, I can't threaten people. I cannot harass people online. So you know, I can't defame, or I can defame, but you know, there are legal consequences, or libel and things like that. So in terms of the boundaries already, I think that there are already quite stringent legal boundaries. I think that people, generally speaking, should be able to say their opinion. You know, I think that, as I said earlier, I would rather know, you know, what someone believes to be true, so I can tell them that they're wrong, and I can argue with them or challenge them if I disagree with them. And I think that, you know, there are views that I have, you know, even the fact that I very strongly criticize the current narratives about race, there's many people that would ideally like to silence me or argue that I'm spreading hate speech. So I think that even the notion of, you know, specifically defining what is conceived of as hate, I do find to be problematic. And I'll give you an example. During the 1960s, in America, when homosexuality, for example, was still widely considered to be something that was not acceptable to dominant sensibilities. The dominant narrative was that they wanted people advocating acceptance of gay people to be silenced. They considered that to be offensive. They considered that to actually be spreading hate. You know, they saw that as against, you know, family values and things like that. And so a lot of the time, hate has been defined as a way to actually silence things that we now regard to be positive and okay things for society. So my instinct is to not get bogged down in the kind of conceptualization of hate. My interest in free speech is more about how do we create an environment where we can pursue the truth. And sometimes the truth can be offensive. Sometimes the truth can actually be regarded as hateful.
Yeah, so that actually kind of creating limits on free speech and kind of bringing the notion of hate speech actually brings in a bigger question: who defines hate speech? Exactly. And that is precisely a huge problem. I want to talk about the N-word, actually, because I don't think you've actually, I might be wrong, but I don't think you've actually spoken about it.
No, I haven't.
What's interesting is there is this word which existed before the N-word ever existed, and it literally means stingy. The word is niggardly, and it means someone who's stingy, you know, doesn't like to spend a lot of money. And what's interesting is you could go on its Wikipedia page, and there's a whole host of scandals involving people getting fired of through using that word, or, you know, just receiving some sort of backlash. Has it gone out of control? Has political correctness just gone out of control?
I think that it has gone out of control, because a lot of the time, as you've actually alluded to, the territory to which what is considered offensive is constantly changing. You know, what you know, I read, this is kind of ridiculous example, but I read an article recently, you know, saying why we need to abandon the word marijuana. Apparently that had racist roots in relation to Native Americans. And, you know, most people are just ordinary people going about their daily life. They're not checking on social media every single day what now is offensive and what isn't. And people that push this idea of, like, you know, political correctness don't actually realize that the people that they are damaging, at least in my view, the people that suffer the most from this are particularly working class people, because, you know, a lot of the language that we might be talking about now, and a lot of this academic jargon, is particularly the kind of university class, educated class, that are keeping up with all of the kind of appropriate speech for a given time. Most people don't talk like that. You know, most people use common language that is easily understandable, and sometimes that may veer off into the kind of inappropriate. So to kind of attack people for using language that they've always essentially understood to be normal and are not keeping up, again, I find it incredibly elitist. Yeah, I regard it as elitist. And, you know, again, we can bring people's awareness to why that language may not always be appropriate, but ultimately people are free to say and speak what they what's comfortable for them. It's not for me to regulate the way in which people speak.
Right, exactly. And I think what's interesting about this, in this particular issue, it's the actual word niggardly existed in England in, I don't know, the year 1000, so very long time ago, and I doubt they'd ever seen a black person during those times. So I think it's, why are we so overly sensitive to the N word in particular, whether it's in like normal words or as a word in and of itself, as an epithet? Why are we so sensitive? Is it because of its history?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in the debate about the N-word. You know, we all are very much aware about the kind of horrific history in relation to the way in which it was used in order to demean people of African heritage during slavery. But the reality is, I mean, I now hear, you know, the N-word used by, you know, African rappers in Nigeria. You know, you know, if it's being used by people that had no connection to slavery, who some of them may have even benefited from slavery, but they're okay to use it just because they share a skin color to you, then I find that to be problematic. And on top of that, and this is a story that I've heard a lot, and a friend of mine mentioned it recently, how a lot of people that listen to rap music internationally, they find, you know, if you go to Eastern Europe, you'll hear many people listening to rap music, and they're not familiar with all of the you know, history and all of that to do with the N-word, but they hear it on the music they listen to, and they listen to Black American music, and they're using the N-word, and then they don't even know that it's offensive. All they're doing is hearing it from the music that they listen to, and then they come to Britain and everyone's like, whoa, 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 why are you using that? And again, I think, yeah, and like they didn't realize all they do is hear about it. So it's really bizarre. I personally don't use it. Not if other people choose to use it, that's up to them, but I understand the history, and I choose not to use it. But I'm not gonna start wagging my finger, you know, if someone else chooses to use it. If, you know, it's in music, it's in films, it's literally all the time, all around us.
Right. And what you're saying about Black people using the N-word in their own work, in their music, some people see that as empowerment. Well, the funny thing is like, I have Instagram, so there's a whole load of content regarding, you know, the N-word and what you can and can't say on certain blogs. And I came across this one particular post where it if you're not Black, don't use the N-word. And I want to talk about how the N-word is Black people's word, and it's for them to decide how they want to use it, in discourse, in the context in which they want to use it. It's up to them, and you have no right to say it. If they want to say it as a term of endearment, so be it. As a racial slur, so be it. What do you think about that? A kind of group of people owning a word?
Yeah, I always find it really fascinating when this is said. I'm like, where is this kind of Black clergy or Black Pope area that gets to decide for the entirety of Black people what isn't and isn't acceptable speech? Again, for me, a lot of this is deeply authoritarian. You know, you've really got to be a really, in some senses, arrogant person to believe that you get to dictate to an entire global society what words can and cannot be said. And as I said, you know, if they want to do that, you know, they are free to do it. But I think that we can choose if we're going to use the word. You know, I can say to people, you know, I personally, I don't really like it. I'd rather you not use it around me. That's just my feelings. But like, I'm not going to say you can say this or you can't say that. I totally understand it. I'm not going to stand here and pretend as if I don't understand the motivation behind it. It still stings. It's still, you know, painful for people. But I actually personally would like to get to a point where we don't hold individual words with so much power and significance that some random stranger on the street saying it is enough to destroy your day or destroy your week. I think we're giving too much power away in that instance. I think that we've got to come to terms with the fact that we can't control everything in the world. People are going to say things we don't like, and it's best to be resilient and develop an ability to be able to handle that, than to try and regulate other people.
Right. You're well spoken. I don't see you using any kind of profanity. Why is it that you then don't choose to use that word, whether that be in your personal life or in interviews or whatever it is? Why is it that it's not a personal choice that you make?
So because I don't believe it's my word to reclaim. You know, I've not had the N word shouted to me at the end of a whip, which was really what happened, you know, hundreds of years ago. And so for me, you know, I don't like it. It's like whether, you know, that's a kind of, I still believe it to be a slur ultimately, even if other people try and reclaim it. And it's similar to if there was an offensive word about Jewish people or Indian people. Like, I don't have anything, I'm not personally against other people using it, but because I understand the history, I don't feel it's my language I don't think it's my word to say, oh, I'm going to reclaim it as a source of empowerment. And for me, I don't like it. And so I've made that choice. But again, I'd not seek to impose that on other people.
Right, okay. And with what I was saying before about how people believe that this word should be the word of Black people and they have, you know, the right to choose how to use it. It's interesting because in 2013, there is this Black comedian who used the word, I think his name was Reginald Hunter, and he used the word in a satirical way. He's a comedian. He makes all sorts of jokes, and he got a whole load of backlash purely because of using that word. And I think there's this kind of hypocrisy with only Black people can use it, and then when they do use it through for satirical means or for educational means or whatever it may be, there's backlash. There's a contradiction there.
Of course there's backlash, because I said there's no Black clergy that gets to decide. Right. And I think, you know, and this, people are trying to, you know, essentially speak on behalf of entire communities, and that's just not going to work. I think it's stupid. I don't think there should be a backlash. I think he can say what the hell he wants. And, you know, there's a kind of converse situation where I think, you know, I don't know if you saw it a few months ago, a rapper invited this white kid up, or I think it was on stage, and then he used the N-word when rapping his song. He asked him to rap his song, and he got really angry because he rapped his song and the N-word was in it. I just think there's so much stupidity. There's no consistency. There's no hypocrisy, and there's no consistency. And I think ultimately, you know, that is a perfect example of why, you know, free speech is so important, because we're never going to agree. We're never going to all agree on the terms. The terms are going to constantly change. So ultimately, I respect people speaking what they believe to be true and speaking what is comfortable for them.
Right. Okay. And just trying to move away, I know that you spoke about businesses now jumping on the Black Lives Matter movement and kind of using that as, I would say, for their own self-interest. Do you think it's just normal business behavior to see what the mass likes and cater for the masses? Just like what they do with their products or services, they like to see what the market likes and they like to cater for that. Is it just another example of business behavior, or is there something more ideological, more insidious or sinister to it?
Well, I think for me, I think that is a valid argument, and I do think that you know, businesses generally jump on what you know, they perceive to be, you know, what is essentially profitable. But then for me, I would say that then what's radical about that movement then? You know, why should the establishment, the kind of economic, political, media establishment, if they are endorsing it, then that would mean that they don't believe it to be a meaningful challenge to the status quo. There is no way in hell that the royal family, even, you know, Facebook and all of these big tech companies would endorse anything that they meaningfully believed would challenge them in any radical way. And I think it's an example of how activism now has essentially become appropriated by the elite in order to let them off for what of their other practices. I mean, you know, for a corporation, they can say, oh, well, we're going to do some diversity training, we're going to hire some Black people. But if they're engaging in slavery, you know, in Southeast Asia, no one's going to talk about that because they've got all of these good, you know, points in terms of Black Lives Matter. And so I think that, I don't think any radical movement should be endorsing getting support from the elite, because that to me would suggest that they don't perceive it as a meaningful threat. And one more thing on that, I think that the reason they don't perceive it as a meaningful threat is because there has been so far, real meaningful practical policies that has been suggested to improve the material lives of Black people or any ethnic minority people. I'm yet to hear one coherent program that would actually help people. I'm not talking about, you know, getting more Black people on the curriculum or getting more, you know, Black people on a board. I'm talking about the thousands and thousands of, you know, young Black kids from impoverished homes in inner city London or elsewhere in neighborhoods that are, like, you know, experiencing low educational attainment, crime and all of these things. Where's the programs to help them? And so I find it questionable personally.
So how could we help them? What are some of the kind of practical solutions that we could do to kind of help them and, you know, improve their living conditions or educational attainment, for example?
Yeah, so I would really recommend anyone listening to this check out an organization called Generating Genius. It is absolutely amazing. It takes kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, Black kids, from the age of, I think, 13, and mentors them until they're 18 to get into STEM subjects. And I think they have something like 100% success rate. And what I love about this organization, it doesn't talk about structural racism. It doesn't talk about victimhood. It gives kids a reality check. It tells them that about aspiration. It tells them that they can achieve anything, and not their skin color, not their background. None of these things can hold them back. And for me, that for a young kid that is, you know, in a chaotic environment, that sometimes that is the most important thing that they need. And I said it on other interviews. I think it's incredibly disempowering, incredibly demoralizing to say to young people in particular that, you know, the world, the cards are stacked against them. This country is racist to the core. White people are privileged, and you are, because of you're black, you are like a victim. That is a mentality that will keep people feeling like they don't have the power to change their situation, to change their lives. And I think that's dangerous. I think we need to be encouraging personal responsibility, as I said earlier, aspiration, rejecting cultures and ideas like you're acting white that somehow frame, you know, a well-spoken, a kind of patriotic and educated Black person as somehow acting white. All of these things, I think cultural elements are massively missing in the conversation. And I think that's the way that we improve people. That's what I've seen, how successful people make a success of themselves and stop pushing forth a very victimized narrative about society.
I have a bit of a controversial question with respect to this organization. Why Black children? Surely any child living in poverty will be subject to, you know, the same amount of, you know, hopelessness that they might feel, you know, financial disadvantages, irrespective of race, whether you be white, Asian, Pakistani, Black, whatever. Why Black children in this case?
Well, personally, you know, I think that they're doing it now, but I think even in general, I think all children that are from low socioeconomic backgrounds need support. I'm not one of those people that think that different support or charities should be ring fenced off based off of ethnicity. But I think for many charities initially, there was a belief that there was a unique problem amongst Black kids. And actually what has been found is no, that's not necessarily the case. The issues that are facing poor Black kids in London are the same issues, or very, very similar to the issues facing poor white kids in the provinces in England, in other parts of England. So I think I agree with you, actually. I think we need to move away from race-based policies completely and start realizing that a lot of these issues are more actually about class than anything else.
Right. And so just to kind of like round things up, what kind of practical advice would you give to someone trying to learn about race in the UK or even in the US, racism, what can we do as individuals in terms of our own personal responsibility to kind of, you know, better the conversation?
So I would say always look at the opposing argument. You know, this is something that's missing. I mean, we hear these books like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race and White Fragility, and we assume that, again, these ideas speak for the entirety of an entire race of people. Actually, there are many cutting edge African American and also British thinkers that fundamentally challenge these ideas, and we should be talking to them. We should be reading their work, whether that's in America, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Kamel Foster. These are a few examples of people that have a fundamentally different conception of the nature of racism in America, and they are African American, and they're deeply intellectual, deeply thoughtful thinkers. So one, always listen to the counter argument. Don't accept things. Even me, I'm sure other people are going to criticize and challenge, and I welcome that. Two, always think about the social consequences of the things that we're saying. And I think the reason I say this is because even if something might feel nice, talking about, you know, white privilege and like anti-racism, even if we're using all of these lovely, you know, convenient terms, what are the effects of those things in people's lives? So one of the things that I talk about in the trigonometry interview is a lot of white people I've met, genuinely good, don't have a racist bone in their body, all of a sudden, and have worked their ass off to get to where they are, all of a sudden being told that they're privileged because of their white. And I think that that's a recipe for resentment, because people are like, no, I've not been privileged, and I don't accept somebody just telling me that and I'm forced to accept it. So I think that looking at how these narratives are actually impacting social relations, are they making people more cohesive, more understanding, or are they dividing people? And I think that these questions, these kind of deeply reflective questions are missing from the debate. And again, as I ultimately say, what can we do first and foremost before we change society, before we try and reorder the society that took thousands and thousands of years to build? What can we be doing? And I find that when people have that mentality, I see such a transformation. I see people thinking that they can take on the world and nothing can stop them. And I think I think that's a much more positive and uplifting message than what we're hearing at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your input. I really do appreciate the time you've taken out to talk to me about these questions that I've had.
Thank you. Thank you so much.